Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 14th of December, part one of The Outsiders.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not. Yes, indeed, and for the very last time this year. What a year it's been. And to reflect on the majesty that has been 2014 in politics, our guest today, Bernard Keane, National Affairs Editor for Crikey. Patricia Cavalis, she's Victorian Editor for the Australian newspaper, and Chris Berg, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, columnist and author. Welcome to you all.
Hello.
Hi. I'm sort of tempted to say, cheesy Christmas party. Highs and lows, everybody. Yeah, I'm tempted to do that. In fact, so I think I will. Chris, highs and lows.
Look, it's all been so great. Okay, so highs from the government's perspective.
It's been a year of achievement.
It's been a year of achievement. No, but the carbon tax repeal is an end of an era. We fought about a carbon tax. We had a carbon tax briefly, and now we no longer have a carbon tax. That's a story, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, that probably isn't quite finished yet, because the government is doing some interesting rethinking of its position with the climate fund and so forth. But it was actually, in the last decade of Australian politics, it was a really significant moment, and it was rightfully a win by the government.
A few years in sync with scientific method, and then zot.
What are the lows? What are the lows, Chris?
Give us a low, Chris.
Give us a low. Get low.
Set a low benchmark. Okay, look. From my perspective, I think one of the clearest lows was the switch from being for freedom of speech to being in favour of security as opposed to freedom of speech, and the August 5th press conference, which is a date that is etched in my brain, when they abandoned the promise to reform 18th the Racial Discrimination Act, and then announced a massive suite of national security measures, not least of which was mandatory data retention. I think that was a really significant philosophical moment for the Liberal Party in general, and really important for the debate about civil liberties in Australia and where we go from here.
I mean, the point Chris makes there about 18C, Patricia, is sort of emblematic of
interesting, and
the quest for meaning from the government.
I see that as actually the other way around to Chris. Sorry, Chris. But I see 18C as one of the government's lows for the year, in that it chewed up so much political capital for such a long period of time. Just lacked a lot of mainstream support, quite obviously, which is why they shelved it. Why else? No doubt, I see how Chris sees it, in that the government had promised something and then reneged. But I think to have made it such a high priority, its first year of its first term was a huge mistake. Therefore, you'd call it a low. But I've got to give you a high, the rise of Julie Bishop, because I do see her now as Tony Abbott's successor, or even perhaps rival, depends how you want to frame that or how you see the internal machinations there in the Liberal Party. And the other major low, going back to a low, is obviously the entire mismanagement of the budget strategy, shoving too much into the budget, and the failing the basic fairness test, which it's done. And now we're seeing daily announcements trying to fix that.
And what's that about, Bernard? I mean, there's been a year of sort of struggling with stuff, a couple of days of undoing all that stuff, and presumably next year we'll get to another phase of the things we'll do next.
Or perhaps I'll just repeat what they've been doing. I mean, I've been waiting for this government to get its act together and start acting in a reasonably competent fashion, and they're still not doing it. Come back in February, and the same parliamentary battles will be going on the same. We'll still be talking about a bloody co-payment, in the lead up to the next budget. I mean, and this is before we hear what is in the mid-year economic forecast, which could be very gruesome from a deficit point of view. Look, economically, there have been some positives. I mean, the economy's been weakening ever since the budget, more or less. But throughout that, Matthias Cormann has conducted a very successful sale of Medibank Private. That's something that should have happened ages ago, and he has done it very well. And he's got far more money than was expected. We thought we were going to get $5 billion for Medibank Private. He's ended up getting $5.7 billion. It's all gone very well. That's good from the government's point of view, it's good from the taxpayers' point of view. It's hard enough as it is at the state and federal level to argue for privatisation. Cormann's managed to competently, quietly, and successfully sell Medibank Private.
But quietly and successfully is kind of the point in that. I mean, like so many of the things that the government actually got a bit right, it kind of gets buried. You know, the general sense of background is
and I think
incompetence and negativity.
Those 3 free trade agreements, mining and carbon tax removal, whatever your ideological or policy view on, but actually they were core election promises and achieving them. And of course, the other one, if you want to use Tony Abbott's language, which I think we all do now, stopping the boats, which has also lots of humanitarian concerns around it, but has been a success as well. And I think too much of a success. They want it back on the agenda, and now it's off the agenda.
I think they're a little bit frustrated that they stopped the boat so successfully.
And these are, I think why they're so frustrated is these were actually quite a good suite of achievements.
And they get no credit for it.
They don't. And all of the negative stories that I think they have politically mismanaged, though, are dominating. And that's the news cycle.
They were incredibly significant during the Running-Gillard year. So this government has, as an incredibly successful opposition, defined itself very strictly against its predecessors. It feels in some way that it managed to get the Labor government out of power sooner than it otherwise would have. And so those are really big successes. And the reason that we're talking about the budget is because that's the third prong of their positioning. They're going to get the budget back into surplus, and they've been unable to do that. So I think when historians look back at this first year, they're going to call this the budget year. This was the 2014 budget that became such a boondoggle on top of the government.
I'm glad you used boondoggle, Chris. That's a lovely thing. I mean,
thank you for that too, Chris.
It's the story of the year.
I'm not sure the word was actually correct. But,
well, it's gone now. Much of the focus, of course, on the Treasurer's performance.
The change to fuel excise. The people that actually pay the most are higher income people with an increase in fuel excise. And yet, the Labor Party and the Greens are opposing it. They say you've got to have wealthier people or middle income people pay more. Well, and change to the fuel excise does exactly that. The poorest people either don't have cars or actually don't drive very far in many cases. But we are actually, they're opposing what is meant to be, according to the Treasury, a progressive tax.
And there, Patricia, I think we heard the year in a nutshell.
And there sort of is that pivotal moment where everyone thought, oh my Lord, he's the Treasurer. Very, very bad moment for the government and for Joe Hockey. I think he's been on a trajectory which has not been a good one since that moment.
But there we had the birth of the fairness thing, the sense of what...
And let's not forget, after he made that statement and was, widely mocked, he tried to defend it on the figures for a while.
Charts were issued.
And media releases came out from his office saying, hey, no, we're right. This is, here's all the data.
And of course, that in the tabloid press, including, I think, the Courier Mail's front page was one of the most memorable to me, mocked him so strongly, and it was just such a humiliating moment.
Which is, of course, what we've now seen in the past few weeks from the Daily Telegraph.
That was an issue that was actually one of the most defensible budget measures of all.
That was a goodie.
As Abbott correctly noted, I think he was in Washington at the time, so it didn't get quite as much coverage as it might have, but he said, look, this is in effect a carbon tax. And he was absolutely right.
But it was rather strange.
It was a strange thing, damn strange thing for Tony Abbott to say. But why on earth the Greens and Labor were opposing it? That is every bit as crassly opportunistic as anything that Tony Abbott. But there was Joe defending this policy, very good policy, on the basis that poor people didn't drive cars. But what does he think?
I told him that was a good idea.
Where was that advice?
It was unprompted. He was not asked a question about fuel excise.
And this is one of the longer term worries that I'm starting to have, that both the Labor government and the coalition government don't seem to have been getting very good advice from the Treasurer's office or the Treasury, or something is happening that seems to be suggesting that to the coalition that they just need to keep doing what they're doing, do some marginal things to get the budget back into surplus because we'll grow our way back and all that sort of thing. Both governments have thought those sorts of things.
That's not the advice of their Treasury. I mean,
well, you hope
this is political advice, though. The framing of this was political. It was about countering the fairness issue, actually, and saying, but the poor people don't drive, so it's not unfair to them.
Somebody told him that. And
he's the one that delivers it.
We may never know. Joe Hockey, of course, wasn't the only one to stumble, and we've got another stumble here. But this is outsiders looking back at the year that was. Bernard King, Patricia Cavalis, and Chris Berg. Joe Hockey had good company.
The metadata is the cause initiated, the phone number to which it's the difficulty here. I don't want this data for billing purposes, but what people are viewing on the internet. Well, I think we are, as it were, the wrong path. The agencies are the web address is part of the metadata, the website, the web address. Well,
Yeah.
That is incredible.
And of course, that is, of course, the interview that delivered David Spears of Walkley. Thank you. Just so hilarious, really. Just watching.
Brandis was actually he fumbled it a lot, and he made a lot of errors, and he got himself confused. But he was actually pretty clear about what the policy was, which was the interesting part of it, because the policy was that they were going to have URLs, the website address, as part of the data that would be kept. The policy changed over the next 48 hours until it was re-announced by Malcolm Turnbull and then backed up by ASIO and the AFP, which is roughly the policy that we have on the cards today with the legislation they released. But Brandis was actually, I mean, he was correct in his own funny way without understanding.
The weird thing was
That's kind,
he
Chris.
expressed it so badly.
It is very kind.
You're kind.
He expressed it so badly when he himself had sat in on that Joint Committee of Intelligence and Security inquiry that went on for, I don't know, at least a year into mostly data retention, even though there were 43 other proposals from Nicola Roxon. Brandis was an active participant. He was informed, engaged, but
He should have a complete understanding.
he should have had a damn good idea what he was talking about, but instead the Attorney General's Department, which in my view is one of the most disgraceful ends of iniquity in the Australian public service, had got into his head. This is a department that has systematically failed to develop its own understanding of what metadata and data retention actually involves for the last 6 years, and they've managed to turn a bunch of confused bureaucrats into a very confused minister who was allowed to go and humiliate himself on national television.
You're against the AGs. I'm against Treasury. What are you against, Patricia?
What am I against? I love all the public servants that, can provide me information and leak information to me.
I wonder
Frank and fearless advice. I wish they'd give it more often.
At this point, and what we've seen in this first year of the government, are we starting to see a sort of a mirroring of what we saw in the few years since 2010? Is there a sort of a familiar and recurring pattern in Australian politics of a government sort of stumbling around, perhaps centrally constipated with a bit of internal division, an opposition that just sits there and says no?
I reckon that's a bit, there is a degree of truth to that, but I think it's easy to overstate that analysis. I mean, there is nothing like the fundamental dysfunction at the heart of Labor. There are commonalities. I mean, it's the constipation of the Prime Minister's office. There is a problem that is not common to both sides, but is just part of the environment now, which is it's much, much harder to communicate effectively in a cut-through manner in the media of 2014 or even the media of 2010 versus the media of 1995 or 1985 or 2005, because it is much more fragmented media and it's much harder just to get your message out.
Cut through is something which the opposition leader has, he's found his own special way.
These people opposite are the cheese-eating surrender monkeys of Australian jobs, to borrow from an American politician.
We'll work out exactly what Mr. Shorten meant by that.
Mr. Shorten.
They're French. That's really his point there. They're
We
French.
had far too much fun,
French of
though.
Australia.
In those last few sitting weeks, I just thought, this man, he's having such a good time. It's in a legal level of good time.
He's riding high by standing still.
Well, that's the point. Absolutely. All he has to do is don't look at me, just look over there. It might be a very useful political strategy, but I don't think it's good for democracy or policy making.
There's a certain mastery and skill in actually doing nothing, which is, perhaps harder than it appears. But Chris Berg, the circumstances require the opposition to come up with a bit more than nothing. Do they?
Not yet. Eventually, they will have to do it.
I'm not convinced. Look, I would like, as a policy analyst, I would like it if they spelt out their policies early so that we can dig through them, so that we can look at the literature that backs them up. But I think the logic of politics doesn't suggest that they need to. And when the government is, as it is in the polls, when the government is struggling with its budget that's going to last into next year and probably long after that, I don't think Bill Shorten really needs to do very much, as small target strategies have suggested they have for the last 2 decades.
If we're having this discussion this time next year, maybe it starts to be a bit more of an issue. The only sort of caveat to all that is that I think there's an aspect of learned helplessness, certainly to Labor politicians and increasingly to Liberal politicians, in the sense that they are finding the task of explaining complex policy or policy that requires any sort of nuance.
Okay, here endeth part 1, which started 5 minutes early. There was no What the Papers Say this week. Ciao.